So I would like to open this Southeast European Studies online platform. And this month we have two speakers. The first is Petar Dobrev from the Center of Advanced Studies in Sofia. He will be giving the first presentation, and afterwards, so after the discussion of the paper, we have Lovro Kralj from the University of Rijeka with the second presentation. I'm very happy to chair this event today. My name is Heike Karge. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Regensburg, Southeast European History. So let me briefly introduce Petar Dobrev to you. Petar received his MA in history at the Faculty of History, Sofia University, St. Clement Ochridsky in 2013. In 2016, he became an assistant professor of contemporary Balkan history at the Department of History of Byzantium and the Balkans at the Faculty of History, Sofia University. And in 2019, he received his PhD with the dissertation, The Holevich Family, Agrarian Capitalists in the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and Romania in the 19th and 20th century. And the presentation which Petar Dobrev is giving today has the title, The Fight Against the Kulaks in Bulgaria, the Fate of the Large Landowners in Dobrudja after 1945. Petar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Heike, and thanks for being able to present in front of you. It's a really wonderful opportunity for me to share my research to a wider audience, and I'm again thankful for that. As you can see, I focus my research on the controversial topic of the collectivization in Bulgaria, and especially the fight against the kulaks, the so-called kulaks, and the large landowners. I focus on the region of Dobrudja precisely because it's more specific compared to most of Bulgaria. So let me start first with a brief overview of the agrarian situation in Bulgaria prior and during World War II. As most countries in the region, it was an agrarian country. 82% of all Bulgarians worked in the agrarian sector in 1946. And scholars were speaking about this phenomenon of agrarian overpopulation when it came to Bulgaria, but also Yugoslavia and parts of Romania. In this situation, 2/3 of Bulgarian peasants owned less than 10 hectares of land. Cadastre was also lacking, and there were almost no land consolidation in the villages. But as I mentioned, to a certain extent, the region of Dobrudja was an exception. In the 40s, there were at least 43 large capitalist estates over 100 hectares. Just to mention something brief also about Dobrudja as a historical region. As you can see, it's part of northeastern Bulgaria. The historical region of Dobrudja is currently divided between Romania and Bulgaria. The southern part belongs to Bulgaria, and the northern Dobrudja belongs to Romania. This was a contested region. First, of course, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and after that, it was contested between Bulgaria and Romania. But in the period that I'm looking into, it was already part of Bulgaria after 1940. Of course, I'm mainly focusing on Bulgarian politics in southern Dobrudja, but we will also make a brief comparison with what happens in Romania. Speaking of southern Dobrudja, as I said, even from the 90s, it was labeled like a Balkan California, in a way exotic region, specific region, which was very sparsely inhabited. And had all the necessary requirements for large-scale agriculture, something that wasn't the case for the rest of Bulgarian lands. The region had easy access to both the Danube and the Black Sea. The soils were very fertile, predominantly Chernozem soils. At first, they were difficult to cultivate, but with the onset of modern technology, this situation changed. It was also very ethnically diverse and oriented in miniature, as one observer noticed. But all these preconditions, as I mentioned, made the region really suitable for large-scale agriculture, or the so-called chiflikchii, the Ottoman term, which was denoting especially this large-scale capitalist agriculture. And even before 1879, the year in which Bulgaria separated from the Ottoman Empire, 40% of the land in Dobrudja was consisting of these so-called chiflikchii. And the average possession of land in Dobrudja was around 15 hectares, which was almost 3 times more than the neighboring regions. As was already mentioned, I specifically focus my research on the Holevich family. They are chiflik owners, famous with their camels, the use of these exotic animals in agricultural work. But the more important thing is that they owned around 400 hectares in the village of Belgun near Kavarna, which is quite close to the Black Sea coast. Also houses in Varna and Kavarna, warehouses in Kavarna. Okay, so some members of the Holevich family, like Haji Vasil Holevich, were quite influential politicians in both Romania and later in Bulgaria and later in Romania. And some of their relatives, like Dobry Buzilov, were extremely influential politicians in Bulgaria. Buzilov especially became Minister of Finance in 1938 and Prime Minister even in 1943. But as you probably know, situation changed in Bulgaria in 1944 with the general reversal of power in the Second World War, and the so-called Fatherland Front, dominated by the Bulgarian communists, carried a coup d'etat on the 9th of September. With this, the gradual Sovietization of the country started, and an important part of that process was the land reform, of course. In Bulgaria, as in all other socialist countries, the general idea of the communist parties was to generally establish collectives, or the so-called producers' corporations. But this didn't start immediately, especially in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, where the communists needed time to consolidate their power. So both in Bulgaria and Romania, the first thing they did before collectivization was land reform, with the slogan that the land should belong to those who work it in Bulgaria. This started in 1946. And in Dobrudja, land ownership was limited to 30 hectares per family with this reform, and private individuals could no longer buy or sell land. Of course, the creation of producers' cooperatives on the pattern of Soviet kolkhoz, the so-called TKZS in Bulgaria, also started in this period. But it started initially quite slowly. But as I said, I will focus on what happens to, especially to these large chiflik estates in Dobrudja. Of course, they were seen as a potential enemy of the newly established government, And of course, the Bulgarian communists were quick to follow the Soviet example. So they were eager to introduce collectivization as it happened in the Soviet Union between 1928 and 1940, with the same goal: collectively controlled and state-controlled farms like the kolkhozy and sovkhozy in the Soviet Union. Part of this collectivization, an important ideological tool in this collectivization in the Soviet Union, was the so-called dekulakization. The government portrayed kulaks as class enemies of the Soviet Union, and more than 125 million individual peasants were labeled kulaks and repressed in some form or another. A lot of them were executed or forced into internal exile, while all of his land was expropriated. As most of contemporary research shows, this form of dekolokization and collectivization was implemented with the use of massive violence in the Soviet Union. So, of course, this was a controversial process. It was a violent process, and in a way, it had to be implemented in Eastern Europe as well. It caused a big social change and, of course, a lot of opposition as well. Of course, Bulgarian historiography has already tackled this subject in one way or another, but in more general terms, researchers like Vladimir Migiev or Mikhail Gruev have very fruitful contributions to the subject of collectivization, but as I said, in more general terms, or in the case of Gruev, focusing more on the Bulgarian Northwest, where large-scale agriculture was almost lacking. In a way, with my research, I want to fill this historical vacuum and try to trace the fate of these chiflik owners who, although few in numbers, were extremely influential at the local and national level. Of course, they were quickly blamed and labeled as kulaks. Especially also in the Soviet Union, the term meant more broadly speaking, capitalist peasant or village capitalist. And later, as I said, the term was exported to Eastern Europe. But not only big landowners like the Holovich family fitted the kulak term. In the process of collectivization, the term was quite arbitrarily used and could in certain periods mean all manner of peasantry, including wealthier peasants, village elites, and any sort of critics of the official party line. Speaking directly about Bulgaria, Bulgarian communist leader Tito Chernokolev, who was Minister of Agriculture in 1947, made this description of the kulak. Who is a kulak? What class group do kulaks constitute in our village? The kulaks in a village. These are capitalist exploiters who organize their farms with hard hand, exploit other men's labor, and amass a fortune. Besides, we must take into consideration the various extra enterprises operated by kulaks in villages: taverns, mills, creameries, cart machines, and other side enterprises, the links of certain social classes to trade capital. And of course, the party was quite eager to attack these capitalists as they saw them and as they actually were in the broader sense of the word. Of course, the party copied in a way the Soviet example. but not 100%. According to the official party lines, there was a fight against the kulaks in Bulgaria as well, but no forceful dekulakization or raskulachivanie as in the Soviet manner. So the kulaks in Bulgaria were not liquidated as a class as in the Soviet Union. There wasn't so much direct violence. The kulaks were rather liquidated peacefully using economic measures and restrictions. And in a way, historical documents show that's part of the story. Because the party really implemented quite a few measures that neutralized and marginalized large landowners. And I will put my attention to these measures. The first and most important of it were the agrarian reform in 1946, of course, but it was not the only one. There was also an introduction of progressive income taxation in 1946, which made taxes really almost impossible for big landowners. Also very important was the compulsory purchase of large machinery, which happened in 1948. Because as you can imagine, without modern machinery, without modern agricultural technology, you can hardly manage to cultivate a big amount of land. There were also the forced collection quotas, which started already from 1944. This meant that each landowner at the end of the year should have to give a certain amount of production to the state. This amount was fixed, and it didn't take into consideration whether the year was good, whether if the weather conditions, for example, were good enough so the quota can be filled. These collection quotas were put quite high for big landowners and were really difficult to meet. So as a result of these three measures, the agrarian reform, the compulsory purchase of machinery, the progressive taxation, most estates were liquidated already before 1848. But what remained was further attacked in the period 1848-1850, when collectivization was officially proclaimed and new collection quotas and taxations were implemented. So if we focus on large-scale agriculture, the agrarian reform is really important. As I label it, it's like dekulakization before the real dekulakization. Because in 1946, the party propaganda, the party documents still don't speak about kulaks, do not aggressively target them, but still the agrarian reform is targeting especially large-scale agriculture. There an upper limit is put for landed property, and it is 30 hectares for the richest region, Dobrudja, and 20 hectares for the rest of the country. Of course, also other big owners like the church, the Waqfs are attacked by this agrarian reform. Officially, the seized land should be paid to the owners, but in the conditions of collectivization, real payment of the seized land was never carried out. So when this, even at the period the agrarian reform was implemented, there was strong opposition. At that period, in 1946, the Bulgarian communists didn't have complete monopoly still. There was opposition, especially from the Bulgarian Agrarian Union. And there were voices that said that this agrarian reform was a confiscation of landed property, a form of expropriation, and that it foreshadowed gloomy economic perspectives for the whole country. Vladimir Popov, an opposition politician, said that big landowners do not deserve such an unfair treatment. Most of them have dedicated their whole life to a noble cause, to create model farms with the assistance of the state. Okay, but these model farms were capitalist, so normally in the logic of the Communist Party, they had to be liquidated in one way or another. So actually, the Communist Party, or the Bulgarian Working Party, as it was called at that period, was quite clear in its intentions. According to party documents, the reform had a clear anti-capitalist intent. The interests of large landowners were affected. The economic foundation of the kulaks were undermined. And as a result, laboring peasants were freed from exploitation. Landless and small landed peasants began to cultivate their land. A centuries-old dream of theirs came true. But not for long, as it turned out, because only 2 years later, in 1948, the party started its official collectivization campaign. What's good for us, for historians, is that during the agrarian reform, the state collected information for all large estates with the land, machinery, and cattle that was about to be confiscated. So this is actually, on the right, you can see one such document, which lists some of the chiflikchii estates in Dobrudja, with the specific village, the amount of land that they owned, and the amount of land that is about to be confiscated. Also later, the party made certain questionnaires to chiflik owners, in which we can see the type of machinery they have and also what kind of cattle. In the forms, there was also a paragraph about local peasants' opinion on what should be done with the confiscated land. It's interesting that in almost all of the cases, the peasants wanted the land to be shared amongst them and not to be collectivized. But of course, as I said, after 1948, it was exactly what happened. But still, with the agrarian reform of 1946, a lot of land was confiscated and part of it was redistributed to poor peasants. 23% of rural households were provided with land, but very few TKZS or collective cooperatives were formed in this period. The large number of TKZS appeared after 1948. So apart from the agrarian reform, there were, of course, other methods of repression. As a rule, the kulaks were to blame for all economic hardship and failures of the new cooperatives, and their initial failures were attributed to kulaks penetrating into them. One of the important aspects of party policy was the creation of a social intolerance toward these people, the kulaks. It was achieved mainly by pointing an accusing finger at them. Their names were usually on special lists, prominently displayed, and condemning their graffiti were painted on their houses. And there were also refusals to serve them in stores, taverns, and cafes. But curiously enough, after most of large-scale agricultural estates were already liquidated with the agrarian reform, the party started its official dekulakization campaign in 1948 as part of the intensifying collectivization. And of course, as part of copying the Soviet example, um, the number of cooperative started to raise quite quickly. But as in the Soviet Union, the term kulaks was quite arbitrarily used. Even peasants with 7 or 10 hectares were labeled kulaks, while with such amount, it's difficult to assume that they were actually capitalists or exploiting other peasants. Um, it's interesting that still some chifliks survived. They survived the agrarian reform with the 30 hectares that was allowed by law. And they also survived the initial decolonization campaigns, but even they were forced to give up their land in the beginning of the 50s. Some of these kulaks were initially allowed in the TKZS, but later forced to leave. As a whole, most Bulgarian land was collectivized by 1962. I think I hope I managed to give the overall framework of the process, and now I will focus quickly on some personal stories. Like, for example, this man, Jordan Mahalnishki, he was a big landowner in Dobrudja and also a mill and factory owner in Kavarna. During the um, during the interwar period, he was also a mayor of Kavarna, a member of the Romanian parliament. But already in 1945, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for a supposed anti-communist activity, and all his property was confiscated. So this happened even before the agrarian reform. So there were such cases of direct violence against presumed um, enemies of the new state. As I mentioned, I also have a specific interest in the Holovich family, and when it comes to collectivization, I came across these memoirs of Gin Kutashev, who was from the Belgun village. I quote, nationalization can come in 1947 on a rainy and muddy day. The camels, the symbol of the family, passed by us. They were taking them somewhere, to the zoo in Sofia, as we later found out. I can still remember the incident in the office, how grandfather Zahari was called and how he arrived. I was young, just graduated from the junior high school and accounting courses. Kolovich came in, greeted, well-mannered, dignified, polite, with a beard and a cane. The political department informed him that they would confiscate all his oxen, horses, and carts, and they would start demolishing and removing the stones from the buildings in order to build the TKZS and stables. I can still see his eyes and tears, but also his dignified demeanor. He only responded to the destructive intentions. If you have decided that way. Of course, there were other direct ways to repress the Holovich family. Both Zahari and his younger son Petar were arrested in the wake of the 1948 elections. They were both labeled kulaks and enemies of the state. Later, Petar Holovich was sent to the Belene labor camp for a brief period due to his support for the opposition. In 1948, some of Holovich's lands were arsoned, and as a result, in 1951, Zahari finally gave up his remaining 32 hectares to the Belgun collective. It's interesting to see what happens to his family later. His eldest son, Vasil, was actually allowed to continue his lawyer practice in Dobrudja in 1946, but all his 50 hectares were confiscated. Later, his daughter studied at the Sofia University and worked there throughout her life as an associate professor. Petar Holovich, the younger son, was not allowed to enroll in university, but was later given a minor state job. Later, he bought an apartment in Varna, and his son studied at the medical university. Zahary's daughter, Penka Holevich, was involved with the opposition, but was sheltered from repression as her husband was a well-respected doctor in Balchik. Later, both their children studied at the medical university. After Zahary's death in 1955, the family was forced to pay inheritance taxes for the properties that had been confiscated almost 10 years ago. So, as you see from these examples, of course, there was repression, but in a way, it was limited. It was milder than what happened in the Soviet Union, where kulaks were most often physically liquidated, and both them and their families had no chance of further professional careers. But still, of course, the shock was big, even for these families in Bulgaria. Another personal story that I came across was by Mikhail Penchev, a chiflik owner from Vodenichene. I will not waste time to read the whole of the citation, but to sum up, I'll just read the final part where he says that he will never agree that equality and fraternity could be achieved through violence, as it happens today. Of course, his land and buildings were confiscated, but still his daughter Stanka Pencheva later studied at the Sofia University and even became a famous poetess with numerous state awards. Something similar happened in the family of Pet Kuganev, another chiflik owner from Chilina, again in Dobrudja. He owned a 45-hectare chiflik and also a mill. The mill was quickly nationalized after 1944, and the land forcefully collectivized with some of the cattle slaughtered. But Ganev received a relatively mild treatment because of the interwar period, when he helped some communist revolutionaries with food and money. Later, one of them, the so-called Popetu, became a party official in Dobrudja, and this allowed the family to have a relatively normal life. And Konstantina Petkova, the granddaughter of Pet Kuganev, also studied in Sofia in the musical academy and later became a famous opera singer. On an interesting note, nowadays the former chiflik has been transformed by Petkova into a summer concert hall. If we make just a brief comparison to what happened in Romania in the period, the general framework is quite similar. There was a land reform in 1945, a year prior to Bulgaria, which aimed exactly the abolishment of large estates and the elimination of the former aristocracy as a class, thus removing a major obstacle to communist rule in the countryside. Of course, the Romanian social and agrarian structure was quite different than Bulgaria, and there were really quite a lot of estates, over 50 hectares, even in 1948 after the reform, compared to zero in Bulgaria at that time. So the two states are not equal in that respect, but still we can see the levels of violence in Romania. There were a lot of arrests. Many owners were punished with forced labor. Their property was confiscated. They were deported with their families and placed under house arrest in various locations across the country. According to one Romanian historian, at least 9,000 great landowners and rich peasants were deported. Which of course is much more than the Bulgarian example. To sum up, in a way, we can, speaking about Bulgaria, we can speak of domesticating the revolution. Here I use an ample term that the American anthropologist Gerald Keith used in 1998. In his book, Domesticating Revolution, from Socialist Reform to Ambivalent Transition in a Bulgarian Village. Uh, Maybe because Bulgaria was a smaller country, maybe because big landowners were not so numerous as in Romania, the colonization in Bulgaria was definitely not so violent as it was in other countries. Yet, in the official logic of the Bulgarian Communist Party, it was inevitable since it was connected with the destruction of the capitalist class in general and with the establishment of the socialist mode of production. So decolonization was seen as an integral part of this socialist restructuring of agriculture. And of course, there were certain agents of change that facilitated this process and maybe helped in making it not so violent as it was in the USSR or Romania. Such an agent of change is Boris Stefanov, a person with a very interesting biography. Himself, he was heir to a landowner's family who owned more than 4,000 hectares in Dobrudja. He was related to Holevich, but despite his class origin, he chose the socialist, the communist ideal. He became a member of the Bulgarian Socialist Democratic Party already in 1904, and later had a quite important career in the Romanian Communist Party. And even in the period 1934-1940, he was the general secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. In 1944, he returned to Dobrudja and assisted collectivization, probably helping its not so violent ways. Another such agent of change is Tinu Hajitinev. He also owned around 400 hectares in Dobrudja and was related to the famous Bulgarian Romanian communist Cristian Rakovski. Tinev also, of course, lost all his land, but realized the communist ideal, which, as you can see also in this citation, was his idea all along, also during the Second World War. To sum up, of course, collectivization and decolonization were a deeply controversial, problematic, and violent project, both in the USSR and later in Bulgaria. There is still abundant academic discussion whether collectivization served rather ideological or practical goals for the Communist Party. According to me, collectivization definitely aimed at modernizing agriculture, but with paradoxical results, because most modern large capitalist estates like the chiflikchii research were very quickly destroyed in 1946, and all their machinery was scattered around the country. In 1948, just a few of these chifliks were turned into state-owned agricultural estates. Together with mass collectivization, this caused a serious crisis in agriculture, especially in the region of Dobrudja, that was admitted even by party officials and lasted until the 1960s. And if we return to the memoirs of Mikhail Penchev, that chiflik owner from Yambu, he said, "I would be glad to drink this cup so bitter to me if I was convinced that it was all for the good of the working majority." Of course, it's difficult, it's even nowadays difficult to answer if collectivization was for the good of the working majority. Not only in Bulgaria, in the whole of Eastern Europe, collective farms existed for a very limited period of time. In 1985, Nigel Swain wrote his book, Collective Farms Which Work, about Hungarian collectives. And he was impressed by some of their results. But as you well know, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the general fall of all communist regimes in Eastern Europe and also in Bulgaria, collective farms were abolished. And in the 90s, there was a quite quick process of decollectivization. So collective farms functioned only from the 50s until the early 90s. And they are still a point of big historiographical discussion. Of course, I hope that with my work, I'm part of that discussion. Thank you. I hope I didn't abuse much of your time, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Petar, for this insightful, very detailed presentation. Thank you very much also for the comparisons, especially, of course, with regard to the Soviet Union, but also for the brief insights into the Romanian case. Our second speaker is Lovro Kralj from the University of Rijeka. It's quite funny because we met like 3 days ago at the conference in Regensburg. So I'm happy to introduce Lovro to you now. Lovro is an historian in the fields of fascism, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust studies, and he has a strong focus on the countries of Central and Southeastern Europe. As I said, he works at the University of Rijeka as a research assistant and an historian. Lovro received his PhD from the Central European University, and he holds or was holding a lot of scholarships, among them the junior fellow. Lovro was a junior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies from 2019 to 2020, and also from 2018, a research fellow at the Holocaust Educational Foundation with a Sharon Abramson research grant. And today, Lovro is presenting on a subject which derives also from his dissertation, from his PhD, and the title of the lecture is, as you see, The Holocaust in Southeastern Europe in a Comparative Perspective. So, Lovro, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Heike. You can see the screen and you can hear me well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here, even though we saw each other just 2 days ago, some of you. So in my talk today, I will not focus so much on grand theories and big answers regarding the region, but more on open questions within the field, as well as potential new research directions in historiography concerning the Holocaust in Southeastern Europe. So there has actually been strikingly few scholarly works which deal with the Holocaust in the region of Southeastern Europe from a comparative or entangled history perspective, even though the region, as I will argue throughout the presentation, offers a set of case studies which provide us with an opportunity to test various theories, paradigms, and methods on a European and global level of Holocaust and genocide studies. So Southeastern Europe was a home to more than 1 million Jews, or 10% of the entire Jewish population in Europe. And these diverse communities consisted of both the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, but they were largely wiped out during the Holocaust. Only recently did historians more strongly point to the fact that up to 10% of all victims of Holocaust weren't killed by the Nazis, but by non-German perpetrators. So besides Nazi Germany, there were only 2 other European states, not societies, which were systematically killing their own Jewish citizens through their own institutions, their own perpetrators, and their own web of murderous methods. These were the independent state of Croatia and Romania, both countries located in Southeastern Europe. Despite these facts, the Holocaust in Southeastern Europe remained and still remains in many ways on the periphery of mainstream Holocaust historiography. Why is this the case? And this brings us to the first problem that I would like to address in my presentation. This is the interpretation of causality behind the Holocaust in the region, which is often reduced to a very vague and problematic term of collaboration. Even though the word collaboration refers to cooperation on a joint project, in the context of World War II and Holocaust, it acquired a pejorative and polemical connotation, signifying primarily the collaboration of native political forces with Axis occupiers. Thus, it became a loaded term which refers primarily to betrayal and national treason. According to the narrative of collaboration in Holocaust, the Nazis were the driving agents of the destruction of Jews anywhere in Europe, and rest were merely puppets or followers of this grand Nazi plan and the strategy. This gave birth to a Germanocentric approach to interpretations of the Holocaust across Europe and Southeastern Europe included. These interpretations had a major impact on public memory as well. For example, in a survey from 2007 in Romania, 65 of Romanians who have ever heard of the Holocaust, only 28% of them knew that it happened in Romania. Of these, only 11% knew that Antonescu's regime, which was active during the Second World War, had been responsible for the murder of Romanian Jews. 79% of them blamed primarily German perpetrators for implementing the Holocaust in Romania. In the last 2 decades, scholars started to slowly distance from this interpretation, some going even as far as arguing that Germany and its historiography were fueling Holocaust distortion by insisting that Germans were the main agents of the Holocaust anywhere and everywhere in Europe. Polish historian Jan Grabowski is probably the most famous of these, as he outspokenly argued in 2020 that the exclusive focus on how the Holocaust was solely and uniquely perpetrated by Germany is now in danger of leading to the distortion and even falsification of the history of the Holocaust. While in Romanian historiography, the primacy of German perpetrators has been effectively and carefully deconstructed in multiple works recently, in Bulgaria and Croatia, the narratives are still persistent. So Holocaust in the independent state of Croatia was interpreted, and still in many ways is, as being the result of the Ustasha-German collaboration. However, here the Nazis were seen as the masters, while the Ustashas were merely puppets. For example, some of the first documents of the Commission for War Crimes of the occupiers and their collaborators, which was the central institutions, one of the central institutions which dealt with dealing with perpetrators, gathering evidence, and creating first narratives or interpretations of the Holocaust, wrote immediately after the war what caused the Holocaust in the independent state of Croatia. And I quote, "There is no doubt that the Holocaust was completely organized." I mean, Holocaust, meaning it, there was no name for it back then in these documents, was completely organized and planned by German occupiers. However, in the Ustashas, Germans found pupils who greatly exceeded their teachers. According to the narratives of Yugoslav historiography, the Ustashas were thus a small group of estranged traitors who sold themselves to foreign occupiers. The Commission for War Crimes even instructed its members not to ascribe any ethnicity or nationality to Serbian or Croatian collaborators, arguing that by committing crimes, they lost their right to be called Croatian or Serbian. This essentially populist narrative, which juxtaposed the pure and progressive as well as morally good people and small group of alienated agency-less perpetrators on the other hand, obfuscated many important questions regarding the causality and the decision-making behind the Holocaust. For example, there are very few archival documents, virtually none, which would demonstrate any German pressure on the Croats or the Ustasha regime to start their genocidal campaign against Jews of the independent state of Croatia, including other minorities as well, primarily Roma and Serbs. Second, anti-Semitism in the Ustasha movement wasn't examined as a serious part of its ideology until recently, but it was either analyzed as not being genuine or that it was a mere imitation of its German fascist counterpart. Thus, the roots of the Holocaust in Croatia were not to be found in Croatian perpetrators, but in German ones. Third, this narrative, which was dominant, hides that Ustasha, in fact, did have a degree of support among Croats, even though far from the mass support the Ustasha themselves wanted. We need to keep in mind that the movement, the Ustasha movement, grew from about 3,000 to 4,000 members in the beginning of April 1941 to over 150,000 members by the end of 1941. Thus, the narrative of collaboration forces us to ask new questions when we are approaching research regarding Holocaust and genocides in Southeastern Europe. First, can we still categorize a lot of these regimes as puppets, as was traditionally done in historiography? Or is satellites, which are seen as orbiting around Nazi Germany, but keeping a level of autonomy for themselves, a more appropriate term? Are they protectorates? Are they proxies? Or are they independent actors? This is still an open and very hotly debated question in the field. Second question is, who in fact collaborated with whom? If we take collaboration as an uneven power relation. In many cases in the Ustasha movement, we can actually see that the Ustasha managed to assert their agency. For example, in the deportation plans for Slovenes who were supposed to be deported from occupied Slovenian parts to Croatia and Serbia, the Ustashas actually managed to assert their own agenda and change initial German plans, even in opposition to Reinhard Heydrich, who insisted that Croatia shouldn't be included in these plans. So I would argue that in certain cases, for example, in Croatia, we can clearly see the Ustashas asserting their own agency and showing some of the first diplomatic successes regarding genocidal actions, in fact. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we need to reconfigure the narrative of collaboration to have a more deeper and more genuine understanding of causality and decision-making behind the Holocaust and who were the key agents in this destructive process. The second topic, which I think is still very important and fairly understudied, especially on the comparative level, is the topic of anti-Semitism. So the overall field of anti-Semitism studies was, and still in many ways is, again, dominated by the Germanocentric approaches, where everyone was kind of trying to find the cause for the Holocaust in specific or kind of Sonderweg interpretations of German anti-Semitism and where something went wrong in the end of 19th century, which was in the focus of the analysis. In the recent years, we're again departing, recent years, we can even say 3 to 4 decades, we're departing from this analysis, and now we are increasingly talking about the pan-European phenomenon as anti-Semitism and as a uniquely Nazi problem. This interpretation is, of course, far more inclusive towards other perpetrators or perpetrators from other countries during the Holocaust. Second question, which is still very much open for debate, is the relationship between anti-Semitism and other long-term nationalist aims, which are mostly concerned with ethnic homogenization of the country and consolidation of new states. This is particularly dominant as a debate in Romanian historiography, whether the Holocaust is kind of an outcome of purifying the nation, as historian Solanari would say, or is it particularly tied to specific ideologies such as anti-Semitism? Third, what is the relationship between anti-Semitism and other anti-ethnic ideas? This is a very interesting question, which still hasn't been fully analyzed, especially from the perspective of, for example, fascism studies, where it's an open question of how, for example, anti-Semitism generates hatred towards other groups or vice versa. How do they fuel each other and how are they connected? How do they form narratives of super conspiracies where multiple groups are being involved? For example, in the Croatian case, you would have the debates whether Serbia or the ruling elites in Serbia, Belgrade is under the influence of world Jewry, or is it the Belgrade regime which is using Jews to push its own agenda, or is it an alliance? These narratives of multiple ethnicities which are being persecuted and how they are formed, the propaganda and history of ideas, is still a very interesting question which can yield very interesting research results. Third question, one of the most important questions, is the issue of continuity and discontinuity of anti-Semitism in the region and the various countries. To illustrate this problem, let me turn to the Ustasha movement. The Ustasha movement is very much a disruptor of a lot of the analysis and theories of anti-Semitism because it's not initially an anti-Semitic movement, or at least anti-Semitism doesn't play a very important role in it. Here you can see the statistics on the analysis of the Ustasha newspapers from 1932 1932 to 1934, where he analyzed about 50 articles appearing in them. And the word Jew, Jewish, Judaism does not appear once on the pages of these newspapers. What does appear is extreme hatred towards all foreigners, which is marked in orange as xenophobia. Here you would use and see terms such as stranci, tujinci, and so on, which literally translates into foreigners as a generic universal category. We can see also the continued presence of anti-Roma attitudes, and we can see a very significant growth of anti-Serb attitudes. And also what's very interesting in this chart is that you can see whenever there is a drop in the universal hatred of abstract foreigners, at the same time when this is dropping, these abstract foreigners are taking a shape of a very concrete minority, which is the Serbian, which is anti-Serb sentiments. So this is the situation 1932, 1934, and this is the situation 1941. One of the newspapers, one of the main Ustasha newspapers, we see an explosion of anti-Semitism. Of course, it didn't explode in 1941 because the Ustasha movement was adopting anti-Semitism from 1935 to 1941 continuously. But we can actually see a very radical change in the approaches to anti-Semitism from particular fascist organizations, namely the Ustasha movement. This is extremely difficult to explain for some of the dominant anti-Semitic theories out there. A second problem which we also have is how do we explain differences in anti-Semitism and the amount of anti-Semitism, how we can measure it, and also how can this amount of anti-Semitism actually be used as any kind of a predicator, having a predictive function of violence towards the Jewish community. Here you can actually see a chart from William Brunstein, who did some of the first comparative approaches to quantitative analysis of anti-Semitism. And according to his analysis, which was criticized, to be fair, but there's not much we can compare it with in other in English language, we can see actually that Romania has a staggering amount of anti-Semitism in comparison even to Nazi Germany if we take it from 1900 to 1939. How can we explain these differences, and how can this be used as a predictive value of anti-Semitic action, especially when we consider that Romania is also one of the very difficult cases to apply various anti-Semitic theories, because we have a highly anti-Semitic leader, Antonescu. We have highly anti-Semitic fascist organizations such as the Iron Guard, which is kind of falling out of favor partly in 1941, but is still very active, and a lot of the Iron Guard members are still occupying positions within the government. But this same government is basically stopping or refusing deportations of the remaining Romanian Jews from the old kingdom after 1943. So some scholars actually suggest that such as Helen Fine, for example, she has a very interesting explanation for this, that this is not a discontinuity in anti-Semitism, but in fact a continuity. She would argue that Antonescu, for example, halted the deportations of the remaining Romanian Jews because he believed we can use Jews as a bargaining chip, and because the Western democracies, which are kind of winning in the war, we can use anti-Semitism, or we can use Jews to kind of negotiate with them, because Jews would be kind of a hostage in our hands. Therefore, you're still using anti-Semitism to stop the anti-Semitic persecution or halt it temporarily. So these all also beg a question of, do we need the typology of anti-Semitism to expand our understanding of the causality of the Holocaust in the region? Is the usage of anti-Semitism as a generic term without any further qualification a useful category? Does it explain, or does it kind of hide certain differences in anti-Semitic arguments and kind of the quality of anti-Semitism in various countries? For example, does it make sense to split anti-Semitism into political anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism, and economic anti-Semitism to get to a better and deeper understanding of the causality behind it? Third, problem regarding anti-Semitism in the current scholarship, in my opinion, is what do we do with anti-Semitism from below? This is especially visible in Croatia, where, again, because of these narratives of foreign elites, which are kind of driving the persecution of Jews, and elites, alienated elites of the Ustashas who are simply implementing them, we are very often overlooking anti-Semitism from below, which was very much out there. Here you can see the illustration of, for example, one of the anti-Semitic demonstrations in the streets of the city of Osijek in summer of 1941, where you can see ordinary people marching with plaques demanding either that all Jews be hanged or that they should be taken to forced labor, which doesn't necessarily mean forced labor in the vicinity of Osijek. It can also mean forced labor as deported to the camps. In some of the other photographs, we can also see the inclusion of children into these anti-Semitic demonstrations. And there was not only one of them, there were multiple cases of these. When we come to the issue of perpetration, the current historiography in the region has been largely fixated on the elites or the genocidal architects. The organizers, or kind of the meso-level perpetrators, and ordinary killers on the micro level largely remain understudied. In the case of Croatia, I can give you an example of a person who is called Ivan Tolj, who is a meso level. He's the organizer of genocide, who is not a part of a single publication currently as a biography, as a small paper, and he's not even in some of the main kind of encyclopedia entries on the history of the independence of Croatia. He's a person who was involved in the deportations of 70,000 people. So if we, at this stage in 2023, do not have studies on people who deported 70,000 people, we are still in trouble in terms of how much research has been done and has to be done in the field. Second question regarding what I previously described through these anti-Semitic demonstrations and civilians' involvement in anti-Semitic actions is, do we need to rethink the concept of perpetration itself? Who belongs to the category? And where does the limit of perpetration stop or start? Are people who participated, and there's wide segments of the population which participated in, for example, the redistribution of Jewish property, are they perpetrators, or do they belong to the not great category of bystanders? Do we need categories in between? Are there neutral observers when the Holocaust is taking place and other genocides are taking place? Should these people be classified as simply observers? These are still questions which are very much open to debate in the field. Third question, which is very, very prominent for, or very important for the region of Southeastern Europe, is the multi-ethnic composition of perpetrators. For example, in Croatia, we can see that there are perpetrators coming from the rank of the German minority. There are perpetrators coming from the rank of the Hungarian minority. There are perpetrators coming from the rank of the Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. So how do these multi-ethnic societies behave during the Holocaust? How does anti-Semitism change the dynamic between them? Does it separate them? Does it unite them? These are still also questions open for debate, and much more research is needed, especially on a comparative level. Then when it comes to the issue of genocides, we are very often thinking intuitively, and rightfully so, that genocides are just there to eliminate the outgroup, right? But the aspects of genocides which are creating new men, or they're kind of creating new bonds between the perpetrators, is still something that needs a lot more attention, especially in Croatia. Mass violence in this context was not only used to eliminate different groups, but it was also used to generate what the fascists would call an anthropological revolution, right? To create a completely new moral order by taking it as many people into the genocidal process as possible. So it would be very difficult for them to revert back to their previous kind of moral order, which existed before fascism took over power. Also, very important question in the region, and for a comparative case, is how can we account for staggering differences in the implementation of violence during the Holocaust in Southeastern Europe? For example, in Croatia, the dominant approach, or there is very little violence from below towards the Jewish minority. There are virtually no pogroms with deadly outcomes in the independent state of Croatia. The Holocaust is primarily implemented through the Croatian or the Ustasha-led concentration camps. 75% of the victims of the Holocaust in Croatia died in Croatia and in Croatian concentration camps, and 25% of them were deported to German-controlled camps. How does this kind of compare to Romania, where we have also a variety of murderous methods which are being used by perpetrators, from starvation to pogroms and mass shooting, which is not the case in Croatia. And then finally, regarding the topic of fascism, I would argue that Southeastern Europe is an excellent region to test various theories on the success and the failure of fascism, primarily in Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. So if we look at Croatia as kind of having a very tiny fascist movement in the interwar period, but then an extremely successful fascist movement taken into a context in 1941 to 1945, how does that compare to the success of fascism in interwar Romania and the failure of fascism in Bulgaria? I think that the comparison between three countries can actually yield very interesting results. Second is the issue of fascistization, or the process of transformation of various non-fascist movements into fascist ones. So what are these processes that, for example, radical terrorist organizations or radical right-wing organizations are being pushed, and how they're being transformed into fully fledged fascist movements during the 1930s. This is also related to the question of history of transfers, international entanglements, and shifting loyalties, because as we can see in multiple cases, for example, in Romania, some of the Romanian fascists are under great influence of intellectuals from France, but then they come under the influence of German and Italian fascism. In Croatia, it's first under the Italian fascism, but then the German Nazism plays a larger role. How do these influences impact the authenticity or the genuineness of these movements? Are they merely imitating, or are they adapting these ideas and therefore enriching it with their own intellectual and ideological content? What is the particular fascist contribution to radicalization of anti-Semitism in comparison to other kinds of movements and authoritarian regimes? Does fascism have a particular explanatory value for the Holocaust in Southeastern Europe? I would argue yes, and it's very interesting to think on how fascism can actually enrich our interpretations of the Holocaust currently, especially on a regional level. One open question, which I think is very interesting, is to look at the results of the implementation of the Holocaust. So when we look at Bulgaria and Romania, we see that the Holocaust, or the implementation of deportations, are mostly concentrated on the newly annexed regions, right? So in the case of Bulgaria, this would be parts of Thrace and Macedonia, where virtually all Jews, approximately 11,000, are being deported without any issues, while the Jews from the Old Kingdom are not. Similar story we have with Romania, but on a larger scale, where primarily we have the deportations of Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina, but then there are no deportations for Jews from the Old Kingdom or Regat. In Croatia, we have a very different story. There is no regional approaches to the Holocaust. In Croatia, the Holocaust is being implemented regardless of the borderland status of a particular region. Can we explain this through certain kind of differences in ideological approaches between these movements, considering that Croatia had a fully fledged fascist movement, while Romania and Bulgaria are usually kind of analyzed as the authoritarian regimes? Does the ideology behind the regime and the movements play a role in what the category of cleansing is? Is it an external region where then we're dealing with kind of continuity of expansionist ideology, or in the case of the Ustasha movement, we're looking at the rebirth of the entire territory, which is a unit which needs cleansing? This is, I think, a very important question where we can combine fascism, Holocaust, and anti-Semitism studies to kind of open new questions which are not open so far. So just to conclude, There is still a lot of work to be done. I would still say that Romanian historiography has gone the furthest in modernizing itself and integrating itself into the modern Holocaust studies. It's a very vibrant community of scholars. I could give you 20, 30 names of people who are doing excellent work, and they're really producing scholarship, which is very competitive on a global level and is changing Holocaust studies. For many of the other countries in Southeastern Europe, the overall historiographic communities are no match for Romanian historiography at all. For example, some scholars recently even argued that Holocaust studies doesn't even exist as a discipline in Croatian academia still. It hasn't been established as a field. Maria Vulesica is making this argument quite recently. So in terms of other countries, I would say that there is still a need to build new research and educational infrastructure regarding the three fields, which I think should by default be included in the comparative and transnational approaches. Currently, there is enough literature in English, especially for the case of Romania, that the language barriers are no longer a serious issue for creating deeper studies between different countries. And just something that might be interesting for people who are attending the talk is at the University of Rijeka, we received a couple of projects regarding the Holocaust. So there is now a really nice network of scholars dealing with the topic who are kind of meeting together regularly. So there is now a decision or a negotiation to open a Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Rijeka, which would actually take Southeastern Europe into the focus as a main field of studies, primarily in order to generate research and dialogue between scholars from various countries. We see this as a gap which needs to be filled in the current historiography. So this will be all from me. I hope I didn't step much over the time. If I did, I apologize.
Thank you so much, Lovro, for this really dense presentation. I would like to conclude our today's session. Thank you, Petar, and thank you, Lovro, for giving us insights into your research. Thank you also the audience for attending. And just as an announcer, so we will meet the next time for the Southeast European Studies online platform on the 14th of June next month with a lecture by Martin Walkoff from Sofia and Edwin Peso from Regensburg.